Welcome to Making Peace Visible, the podcast about peace and conflict in the media. I'm your host, Jamil Simon. It's no secret that refugees and immigration are huge issues, not only in America, but globally. Worldwide, an estimated 110 million people have been forcibly displaced, according to the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. Many are escaping wars, gang violence, or repressive regimes. Others are fleeing climate change impacts. Some are leaving collapsed economies where they can't feed their families. How journalists cover refugees and immigration has a major impact on public perceptions. Because it's so important, we plan to spend several episodes looking at the intersection of journalism, refugees, immigration, and conflict. There's a lot of misinformation around this topic. Some of it's quite dangerous. Much of it's deliberate. Our producer Andrea Maraskin and I had a chance to hear today's guest, Dina Haynes, talk about this issue. Dina Francesca Haynes is an immigration and human rights attorney with decades of experience around the world. She worked for the UNHCR in Bosnia and Afghanistan and with the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights in Rwanda. She's personally represented hundreds of asylum seekers and victims of human trafficking. Andrea sat down with Dina to learn what she thinks is missing from the prevailing narrative about immigration and refugees.
Dina Francesca Haynes knows the intersection of immigration and the media. She writes for publications like The Jurist and The Hill and has served as an expert source for journalists at CNN, Vice News, and NPR, among others. She runs the nonprofit legal aid organization Refugee Projects and directs the Immigration Law Certificate Program at New England Law here in Boston. Dina, welcome to Making Peace Visible. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
So I want to start, Dina, laying out some definitions. For the layperson, it can really be hard to wrap our heads around different terms that get thrown around about immigration on the news or social media. So first of all, what is a migrant?
A migrant is any person who's moving. There's no real technical legal definition for a migrant. So a lot of us use it as an inclusive term to include refugees, asylum seekers, people who are traveling with visas, people who are traveling without visas.
And what is a refugee?
A refugee does have a legal definition, which is a person with a well-founded fear of persecution on account of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. And the definition for asylum seeker is the same.
How is that determined?
So in the U.S., we have an adjudication process that's been set up through the executive branch. Adjudicators are immigration judges in the Department of Justice and government attorneys and ICE and DHS. So there are two agencies basically adjudicating these applications depending on where in the process a person hits. But that sort of belies the real elephant in the room with asylum cases in the U.S., which is that you have to be in the U.S. to make an asylum application. You have to arrive in the U.S. and approach a U.S. official to request asylum. And if the U.S. pushes people back from the border and doesn't let them approach, then they never have the opportunity to even begin that international process that is a right that they have under international and U.S. law.
I know that you've represented many victims of human trafficking, and I think there's often an assumption that people migrate of their own free will, even if they're fleeing violence, that they choose to migrate. So how does human trafficking fit into the migration picture?
Well, that's a really interesting question. So you've probably heard the poem that was written by a refugee where he says, "No one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark." I was one of the first people working on human trafficking cases when I worked in Bosnia. And then when I came back to the US had just passed its Trafficking Victim Protection Act. And many, many journalists called me and said, if the US gives a visa to people who have been victims of human trafficking, won't people put themselves into the flow of human trafficking? And I was repeatedly astonished by that question because I actually know thousands of asylum seekers and refugees and victims of human trafficking. And I can't believe for a moment that someone would willingly put themselves into the flow of trafficking in order to maybe later someday receive some kind of immigration benefit. It really plays into the mythology of, the United States as a destination that everyone wants to come to so badly that they'd be willing to harm themselves to get there. I'll tell you a story about a client that I represented 17 years ago. She was coming from China. She had been sold by her father to pay off his gambling debt. She had been sold to traffickers. The traffickers sent her through 7 countries with a fake passport each time. She was 18 years old then, by the way. Each time she didn't know what was happening. She didn't speak the language in the countries that she was being sent through. And then she arrived to the United States and she was in an airport and she got sent to secondary inspection, which is what the US government does with people that they suspect might not be here lawfully. And her trafficker was right behind her. And she said repeatedly, in all the ways that she knew how to say, that she was being trafficked and that they were going to be sending her to do forced labor. And she still got deported back to her home country, where she was then jailed and detained and ultimately re-trafficked by the same traffickers. When she arrived the second time in the United States, the U.S. government decided to prosecute her for misuse of a passport. They put her in federal prison for 2.5 years for the crime of misuse of a passport. And when she was completing that sentence, the U.S. attorney who had prosecuted her called me and said, "Would you be willing to represent her as the victim of a human trafficking? I think she's the victim." The same person who had chosen to prosecute her, unnecessarily, I might add, under federal law. So then I was able to represent her, and a person with a claim like hers can make an application both for a T visa, which would offer her some protection in the United States and status and safety from her traffickers. And I can also apply for asylum on her behalf. So that's a kind of story of a person who might, not be migrating, because migrating has a sort of volition to it.
Well, thank you for sharing that harrowing story. What ultimately happened to that young woman from China?
So I wrote an article about it because it stuck with me for a very long time emotionally. And it's really, really sad. Once she completed her federal criminal sentence for misuse of a passport, she got detained by DHS. So they kept her in the same federal prison, but now she's considered an ICE detainee. And in order to be released, she has to show that she's not a flight risk and not a danger to the community. But she has no identity documents and she has no person in the country that she knows except for her traffickers. So we fought for another almost a year to get her a bond. We raised the money by having bake sales and other things and got her bonded out. The day that she was released, we had no advance notice. We had to race over and try to get her a place in a shelter. And the really heartbreaking part to this story is that we have very, very poor witness protection in the United States for trafficking or asylum cases. And the only people that she knew in the US, and the only way she had to survive and support herself, were to go back to the traffickers. So she ended up marrying one of her traffickers in order to remain in the United States. And I know some people will hear that story and think this is fraudulent all along. I can assure you it's not. That was not her choice at all. Her family back home was still being threatened, and that's the only option that she had available to her.
When I spoke to you earlier about doing this interview, I think I threw out the term refugee crisis or border crisis, and you called me on that. You said that kind of language is hyperbole and that the rhetoric has won. What did you mean by that?
One of the things that I've been thinking and writing a lot about is how migrants are used as a scapegoat for the benefit of regressive leaders who basically follow the same playbook all around the world. And the playbook is you dehumanize people trying to enter by othering them, making clear the stark differences that don't really exist between us and them. And then you ratchet it up by calling them names, literally calling them animals, taking away their humanity, so that these regressive leaders have a reason to use national security rhetoric to tighten down the border, but also, more importantly, I think, to scale back the civil rights and civil liberties of everybody within the country. So when we use phrases like migrant hordes, or we hear, illegals, or even what the statute says, which is it calls people aliens, it really serves a purpose, which is to help these regressive leaders win their legal strategy of giving them some kind of ability to derogate from the rights and constitutional and civil protection mechanisms that exist in the US and elsewhere.
I completely hear you on that. I am particularly interested, though, in the term crisis. To me, it seems like more of a neutral term in terms of, whether you see immigrants, whether you empathize with them or whether you fear them. Crisis conveys some urgency. So what is your reaction to that term specifically?
I think I said to you, you asked me about numbers. Numbers aren't particularly helpful because they're not real. We don't have the capacity to actually count people, but we have some estimates. So at the high point, there were estimates of 14 million undocumented people in the US. And this was in the 80s and 90s. So this was a high point of when you might have heard terms like crisis, because we were seeing a lot more people than we are now coming in from Central America due to all of the civil wars and strife in Central America. At the same time, Republican leaders in the US were granting amnesty to those people, because even conservative organizations like Cato recognized and still recognize and argue that the kind of economy we've decided we want to have depends on those workers. So yes, you might see a figure like 100,000 people have arrived at the border in the last X number of months. But in the greater context of a couple of decades, that's not actually a crisis. It's not a crisis because it's not the high point of the number of people coming. And it's not a crisis because even though I don't like it, we've set up our economy to depend on migrant labor. You can see all over the country closed businesses that can't find workers. We have all sorts of service economy jobs that are dependent on undocumented people. How do we know that? Because Congress limits the number of visa holders who can take what they call unskilled jobs, and there just aren't even remotely enough of those visas available to fill the job needs. We've created this situation. So to turn around and call that a crisis, I mean, I think it's a crisis because I think the lack of humanity is a crisis point. Every couple of years, Congress decides that they have to do something about immigration. And we're so stuck politically now that can't happen, because the first thing candidates for any office start talking about is immigration. Migrants are the foil for all of the ills in the world, which is obviously not true, but it's really politically expedient.
It's such an interesting sort of conundrum, because politicians, especially on the right, will play up a fear factor of criminality, also, just racism and the idea that immigrants are going to take American jobs. But at the same time, as you said, there's the reality of labor being really important to many sectors of the economy. I mean, in an ideal situation, or if you had the power to, influence Congress and get us out of this gridlock, like what would it take for people to see that immigrants are actually essential to the economy rather than a threat?
That's a great question. And the interesting thing to me is that all that data is out there. And it's out there even from conservative groups. If you Googled Cato on immigration, you'd see all of these statistics that I'm about to tell you. And people still don't care. One of the statistics that I think is most compelling, and again, I do not like this situation at all, and I do not endorse it, but it is a really important factor that people don't talk about, which is that our entire Social Security system has been floated by undocumented and visa holder immigrants who pay into the system and don't pull anything out. So basically, we're completely dependent on migrant and unskilled workers who would pay in and then leave if they have visas before they're ever able to recoup anything. And if they don't have visas, never be eligible to recoup anything. Immigrants pay taxes, including undocumented immigrants, at a far higher rate than citizens and other visa holders. So they're contributing. I went to the White House and the Senate several years ago with a group of conservative businessmen to try to make a pitch with Senator Schumer and people in the White House to create more what we call portable visas to mitigate some of the labor trafficking. Most of our visas available for workers are not portable. If they are abused, they don't have the ability to leave their employer and take that visa to another employer. So the leverage the employer has is that if they complain about the conditions of the workplace, like they're never being given breaks or the place is unsanitary, things that we saw during COVID in the meatpacking plants. We saw a lot of these issues, right? People being sick and working on our food. If the workers complain about any of that, they not only get fired from their job, but they get deported because they can't take their visa and go to another employer. It gives all of the leverage and control and power to the employer.
So I want to spend the rest of our time talking about the media specifically. Journalists are often under time pressure, almost always. You mentioned to me before that in interviews you've been asked to sum up complicated topics in an elevator pitch, so to speak. Can you give me an example?
I talked to someone most recently about child laborers, and we spoke for almost an hour. And at the end, I think what was aired was child labor occurs in all 50 states. So that was what he wanted from me, which is fine. But it doesn't do anything to talk about why we have child labor or why we've not paid attention to child labor or what we're planning, what we could do to prevent child labor or whether we even want to prevent child labor. And those explanations weren't offered by other people. They just were not present in the story.
Was this on TV or on the radio?
It was on TV and it had a transcript as well. I mean, NPR, CNN, you can't really say misquoted because it's not that you're misquoted or even necessarily taken out of context, although I think that that's part of it. It's just that it's such a small slice of what you are trying to convey that it ends up being meaningless. If you care about what you're working on and you care about the people that you're working for, you don't want to go talk to journalists because your viewpoint is going to be not represented at all.
Wow, that's sad. You know, the complexity of immigration, it's a problem for getting important information to the public, especially, you know, it's sort of like the wider the audience, it almost is like the quicker you have to get your point across. And it is very complex. There are these different statuses that people are assigned. There are changing laws. There are different relationships between countries that are all factors. How would you advise journalists to strike a balance between oversimplifying and telling a story that's too complicated for news consumers to follow?
I've seen examples that are complicated and still get published and get readership. I really appreciated the experience I had with two Vice authors that ended up doing a series about nefarious organizations raising a lot of money pretending to work on behalf of human trafficking victims, but actually harming them. That's been something that I've written about and worked on for a very long time. They were willing to talk to me repeatedly. They centered the experience of victims of trafficking. And then they contacted me back before they published it to ask if I was okay with what they'd said. And even though I didn't like some of the ways that I sounded in the article, that didn't bother me at all because they legitimately were trying to convey what I was trying to convey. We were interested in the same goal. I think that was a really great example. And maybe a lot of people would have preferred a simpler narrative, but I think there's an argument that we perpetuate harm to migrants, and we perpetuate especially human trafficking because it's a complex issue. It can't be simplified.
It's a fascinating article, that Vice article. I read it, and I'll post a link in the show notes about these organizations, sort of nefarious or misguided organizations who were bringing people out of Afghanistan at the same time that you were actually working with, some sort of intermediary to get a client out of Afghanistan. And he kind of just had learned that there were checkpoints, that there were these barriers, and you were like, well, it's like he's playing a game. It's like he's Rambo. He's not really educated about the situation.
Yeah, and as a consequence, he was going to get my clients killed. And it didn't matter to him. Many of us who've been in this work for a long time have tried to alert donors that a couple of these organizations are not who they say they are, and they're harming the people that they say they're trying to help, which is another reason that I started Refugee Projects, to try to help donors find reputable organizations by using our expertise to vet reputable organizations and try to steer really well-intentioned people towards places where they won't be contributing to harm.
So it's easy to get frustrated with the media, sort of capital M, but journalists, of course, are human beings too. Do you have advice for other experts or activists for what to do when they notice a mistake in a piece of reporting?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of journalists legitimately, everybody's operating quickly and you latch on to the word or phrase that you've heard most recently. So people will say things like illegals. And if you point out to them the harm that comes from using a phrase, or even the legal or technical inaccuracy of using that phrase, a lot of journalists will pause for a second and say, oh, you're right, I'll use something else. Or thank you, for you, I'll use something else. And that's good enough for me. I think a lot of people don't have those good intentions. If somebody's intentionally using words to try to move the dial towards dehumanizing migrants, I wouldn't spend my time talking to them. But I think that most journalists are not using those words intentionally. And if you explain to them for a moment, if they give you the opportunity to take a moment and explain to them why it's unhelpful, they will try to do better.
What's an example of an immigration story that you think deserves more media attention?
Oh boy, that's a big one. I absolutely think that it's appalling that Afghan women are still stuck in Afghanistan with worse conditions than when the US pulled out, and that there's no plan to do anything differently. And some of us are trying to do some small, quiet things to help because we don't want to draw attention to people who could be put in harm's way. I think one of the biggest challenges that I have is that there's been a lot of backlash and violence and threats and doxing in my field, and it makes our work so much harder because we're already trying to protect vulnerable people from precarity, from deportation, from all of the discrimination that befalls them. And to have to be even quieter means that we can't get the public's attention for donor support because we can't talk about what we're doing without fear of bringing violence and unwanted attention to our clients. The threats, the kind of atmosphere that has been created in the last several years where somebody like me talks about migrants and then gets threatened or, the goal is to chill my speech. so I feel under threat and I stop talking about it and stop working. It's really effective. It's very, very effective to make people afraid to do their work. Countries like Germany and Italy and even the United States at one point, were prosecuting people trying to assist migrants. That's a story that needs to be continually told. We have migrants in San Diego at the border on the US side and in Mexico still who are unable to get here. It's not just Central Americans at the southern border. Every person who wants to get into the United States can only do so either with a visa or by coming to the southern border. So there are impossible choices that people are making and traveling on foot for long, long periods of time. I know some of those stories are told, but I think that it deserves a lot more attention. And I would like to think that attention would bring empathy. And I'm afraid that attention too often these days brings threat.
Yeah. I was reading not too long ago about people on the migration journey through Central America who were documenting themselves on social media and amassing a following that I'm sure may also bring threats, but I think it's pretty cool.
I think it's smart too. I mean, I guess if social media has turned us into that kind of world, then it's kind of a human rights approach to document what's happening to you as it's happening to you so that there are eyes on you if something goes wrong. It's what we have always done in the human rights world to, have like trial monitors and send people to places like what journalists do so that somebody is seeing what's happening.
Are you familiar with solutions journalism at all?
No, but I'd like to hear about it.
So the idea of solutions journalism is looking at people or places that are trying solutions to problems. It's not necessarily the solution has to work, but at least that someone is trying. And what does it look like to try something different in whatever area it might be in, environmental conservation or education or, preventing human trafficking. And so I'm wondering if you were, to pitch a solution story or if somebody came to you and said, I want to do a solutions journalism story about immigration, what would you suggest they look into?
Well, I picked the 3 pillars for refugee projects based on what I saw missing in the field. So what I would pitch would be those 3 pillars, that people need legal assistance. You can't apply for asylum without making a legal claim. And the disparity between people who are represented and unrepresented in terms of their grant rates is about 80%. You're 80% less likely to win asylum without legal representation. The same is true for refugees in any part of the world. So that's one of our pillars, increasing legal representation. But that requires that the legal representatives who are mostly pro bono doing this work, in addition to all of their other paying work, that they don't burn out. And the threats and the negative atmosphere and the volume of changes and the fact that you have to go to the middle of nowhere to visit your clients and then get permission from the prison warden to visit them, it turns out to be a lot and it's exhausting. And that's not even mentioning the fact that you end up working with people who suffered trauma all day long, which is not something that lawyers are trained for. We don't really ever hear in law school, although I do try to teach it, that you need to be aware of secondary trauma. So the second pillar is to try to bolster these advocates so that they stay in the game and we don't lose more people. There are very few skilled people out there able to do that legal representation. And then the third is trying to ensure that good-hearted donors who really do want to do something, who want to hear these stories and help, are sending their money and time and interest towards organizations that aren't actually harming the people that they say that they're helping. So we try to partner with organizations and do a lot of vetting to look at the values of the organizations and the work that they do, and we go work with them directly and partner with them, and then can steer donors towards organizations that actually could use the money. That's a solution that I have tried to frame, and I think that that's what I would pitch.
Well, would you like to tell a success story from, that came out of one of those 3 pillars with refugee projects?
Yeah, I think I can now. I just invited recently one of my Afghan clients to join my board because we were able to extract her through one of the most harrowing experiences I've ever been through. It involved a lot of active and inactive military and people helping from all over the world to physically get her out of Afghanistan. She's one of the only women and the only humanitarian cases that's gotten out. And we were able to go meet her when she arrived in the city of Philadelphia. We went down to meet her, got her set up with some housing and employment, and started her application process with an asylum claim, and made that claim and won and got her asylum. And now she is on the road to being a citizen in the United States. And that feels like a success story to me. It literally feels like I'm helping to save someone's life. And that's a success story.
Well, thank you so much, Dina. I appreciate your time, and thank you for the work you do.
Thank you as well. I really appreciate your time and your willingness to listen to the nuanced discussions.
You can learn more about Dina Haynes' nonprofit organization at refugeeprojects.org. They're also on Instagram at Refugee Projects. Check our show notes for links to the Vice News story that Dina mentioned about human trafficking in Afghanistan, as well as some of her original writing. Making Peace Visible is produced and edited by Andrea Maraskin. Faith McClure provides additional editing and writes our email newsletter. Peter Agus is the creative director of the War Stories, Peace Stories project, and I'm Jamil Simon. If you learned something from this episode, please share it with a friend. An easy way to do that is to take a screenshot of your podcast player and send it in a text message. You can also send them a link to our website, warstoriespeacestories.org/podcast. Thanks so much for helping our podcast grow, and thanks for listening.